All right, Jeremy, you want to start with the rec or with the intro?
Yeah, let's start with the framework. So from my end, if I'm remembering correctly, your framework had four buckets: market, competition, capabilities, profitability,
Hmm.
um, which I think is comprehensive. It covers all of the big things as far as I'm concerned. This was a new product launch with a company that had already been working on something in the same industry, or one could argue, an adjacent industry. Uh, I think always in these types of cases, the biggest things from my end, which you highlighted, and I just want to highlight as I view them as the most important, are the profitability of launching this new segment and if the market's attractive. And then I think a close third is, do we have the capabilities to actually do this? Uh, and if we can answer yes to that question, and there was a big market and it'll be profitable, then it's almost always a slam dunk. So those are the three things I consider. It seems like you hit them, and so I'm happy with that.
Yeah, if I could do one thing differently, it would be inverting the order. I actually think
Yes.
orienting, like I think orienting maybe marketing competition first, then
Hmm.
understanding the profitability dynamics of the situation and whether we can do this, and then
Yeah.
some of the more operational stuff at the end there. It's not really this, like I think actually consultants probably in general would under emphasize the operational piece, but that doesn't change the
Hmm.
fact that your interviewer is a consultant. And so they might still
Hmm.
underemphasize that stuff. So overall, though, the framework felt pretty easy. There was like, as a very short prompt.
Hmm.
I think the one insight from the prompt that I think a lot of people would miss is that it's an eyewear business.
Yes.
And while that sounds so obvious, it's almost hidden in plain sight that
Mm.
there are probably some really good synergies there. And so I think leaning into the fact that our target market is quite
Hmm.
related. And so just a slight like turning the critical thinking hat on a little bit will get you a long way on the initial piece of the case. Um,
Totally.
how about analysis?
Yeah. So I wanted to
Oh, sure,
actually
sure, sure.
make a you just brought something up I was going to bring up in the analysis piece, which I really liked that you did, is you didn't take for granted that it was an eyeglass company making contacts. You were like, one of the first things I do is I'd vet how I'm thinking about this sizing with like data from the eyeglass company. So I really like that. The big piece of feedback I would give you on the sizing here is
Mm-hmm.
to check in with me more often on your approach. I was fine with you taking the
Mm.
quicker and dirtier approach rather than calculating each of your age groups out with as much detail. Um, but I would have appreciated if you checked in and made sure with me that that worked before. And I think additionally, as an interviewer, I'm more reluctant to jump in and cut you off.
Mm-hmm.
Interviewers will do it. My personal style is less doing that. So at the same time, I appreciate when you give me chances to intervene, and they can be in the form of, I would love to estimate this in a rougher way. Would that be fine with you? That's all it
Mm-hmm.
would take to give me a chance to give you some feedback and make sure you don't get deep down a rabbit hole that ends up being one that we shouldn't go down.
Nice. Well said. I also felt, and this comes as well from just doing a lot of case reps. I personally felt like I talked a little bit too much in that section. And
Hmm.
while it's great to walk your interviewer through your math, I also was feeling like I maybe left a little bit on the table in terms of bringing you in for dialogue and sense checking. And that shows up, right, in an area where I actually had the number 625 in my head and I said
Yeah.
525. I didn't even notice that I
Mm.
said it. And so when you
Yeah.
initially had me go back, I then realized, oh, wait, I said five. No, it's
Mm.
clearly a 625, whatever, or $6.25 billion market, right? So
Yeah.
just a simple math error right there. And I think while it was immaterial for the outcome of the case, in some cases it won't be.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's worth highlighting. Other pieces of this, yeah, I like your point. Always check in with your interviewer on whether or not you should or can summarize. You don't want to overdo it.
Hmm.
But I think I did a good job on that with selecting the segmentation method, meaning going with age
Hmm.
groups as the initial segmentation. And I thought brought you went on that. But then I a little bit I went a little rogue in the sense that I was like, I don't feel like doing
Mm.
four segment breakdowns when that might be why this case is supposed to take 25, 30 minutes. Is it actually they
Uh-huh.
want you to do a careful analysis there. In looking at like 40% times 60% and 60% times 40%, and then looking at 20 times 80 and 80
Hmm.
times 20, and knowing that all the buckets were 80 million, I was like, these numbers are going to be
Yeah.
really similar across. So
Yeah.
it's probably something like 50 million, and I did it in 4 seconds. But you're right. Maybe your interviewer just happens to be somebody who doesn't like cutting you off, but also just happens to be somebody that wants you to walk them
Yeah.
through the math step by step, right? Which is literally you. As an
Yeah.
interviewer, I would be much more inclined to just stop someone and cut them off and be like, hey, actually, let's go this way. Or I like this idea. Tell me more. So that was, I think, a great combination of where you can go a little bit astray,
Yeah.
both as a function of the approach that you've chosen and how that approach relates to your interviewer's natural style. I thought that
Mhm.
was very interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else on analysis?
Yeah. And just to make that like a broader lesson, it's sort of it's always a balance between being
Mm,
proactive and just taking the next step and making sure that you're on the right track. And so that's
right.
why I always talk about using these questions that are actually proposals for what you do. So in this case, it would have been, hey, I want to do this way. I want to take a simpler approach. And what I'm going to do is, go quickly through each bucket and get a rough estimate. Does that sound like the right
Mm,
approach? Rather than the opposite, which is arguably worse, which is just saying, what do I do next?
I
So it's
agree.
somewhere in the middle between that and like just going on without
Yeah,
asking the
and
question.
there is a difference, right? The difference is like you're asking your interviewer in the case that, what do I do next? That's
Yeah.
like, first off, it creates a dynamic of, is your interviewer going to be doing this case for you? Like, you don't want to ever
Yeah.
make the interviewer
Right.
feel like they have to like do the case. First off, don't ask, like it's not their job. Secondly, like you're not demonstrating your ability to do a case when you're asking your interviewer to do it. Um, so I think that's an interesting point. I also think the way that you say that right now, like a great question, like in the other approaches, you're actually putting forth a proposal. Like you
Yes.
are saying, like, I think this is the right approach.
Exactly.
A question like, how does that sound to you? Rings a lot better than what do I
Hmm.
do next? Or like, I would stop here. Like it just isn't like,
Yeah.
uh,
Way different.
it's not totally different. And that is definitely the better approach.
Hmm.
Okay, awesome.
Cool.
What,
Let's move to recommendation.
yeah, the recommendation. How did you feel about that?
I thought it went well. I think that the thing that it was interesting, and I think you pulled this off well, was a lot of times it's easy in these cases to give like this is definitely the answer, and like I'm definitely starting this company, or I definitely advise they enter the market. But this one, you were quick to admit that it was hard to actually say there was a little bit gray in this one, right? We knew the market size, but we didn't know much about the capabilities beyond that it was an existing eyeglass company or who was going to be leading it. Uh, we didn't know much about that, and you were open about that, and I think you made that the key piece of the recommendation. One thing I do encourage is for people to include next steps.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't think you're not going to be immediately like kind
You're not
of
getting dinged, right?
not
Yeah.
for this
Yeah.
kind of thing, but I think it's always great to show that you're thinking ahead to, hey, we've done this work, but here's what we want to do next.
Mhm. And I think there is, my initial inclination was like, when you asked me for next steps, my initial inclination
Hmm.
was almost like, I kind of just said that in the sense that here are the
Okay.
big gap areas. But when you
Hmm.
really break it
Yeah.
down, there are more concrete things to do within those gap areas. Like it's
Hmm.
one thing to say, like, I think we should investigate the competition more. It's another thing to say, like, I think we need to do voice of customer calls, and I think we need to get industry
Right.
experts on the line and bring in people who understand contact lenses and talk to former executives and blah 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 blah. Right,
Hmm.
and that's exactly what you would do if you were, a
Yeah.
consultant. Um, I think I think one other part, I'm reticent to talk about like things I did well, but I would say one thing I actually thought that I did that was a creative twist, and that you
Hmm.
should feel open to doing in the case is just like we went through an entire like scenario exercise where what are the levers you'd pull if things didn't go well, and turning
Yeah.
that into a positive by identifying like having gone through and having a very rich brainstorming exercise, you actually realize, oh wow, should things go awry, like there's actually a lot of things you can do to ameliorate the
Yeah.
situation. So I thought that was an interesting twist to
Hmm.
layer into the positive leaning recommendation without diluting the magnitude of the risks at all.
For sure. And I think additionally, like another interesting way to spin that could have been like calling it like a pre-mortem, which is that we
Pre-mortem, yeah.
can actually take a lot of insights from asking ourselves this question of, hey, if things go wrong, what would we do? Now we can just do those things before they happen. A lot of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Pre-mortem is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like leaning into the incompleteness of a case is always a
Yeah.
great way to identify, where you should go next, or just like risk areas. It's just like, yeah, we covered these two big areas and
Yeah.
spent 25 minutes, but like we didn't touch on X, Y, Z. And going there is usually really fruitful for people. So, any other like parting thoughts we always cover? Like, so we've covered
Hmm.
the framework, the analysis, the recommendation. What about like other intangibles? We touched a little bit on communication style and like
Yeah.
especially in the analysis section. Any other pieces of this?
For me, I think I got across the main piece in the about communication. So I'm good. How about for you?
Yeah, yeah. I think I felt like there might have been more opportunity for dialogue in general.
Hmm.
And I think worth saying, maybe actually in your case, like as the interviewer, I think you had even more opportunities to like chime in or like
Yeah.
mention X or like ask me a question, like a counter question, meaning like, are you sure about
Yeah.
that? Or like just like sprinkling in a few other things to pressure my thinking. But you're probably still accurate for a first round interview.
Hmm.
But for future
Yeah.
interviews, I would imagine you'll be a little bit harder on me.
Yeah.
I felt like you kind
I
of
will
let
be.
me go in an easy way, in the sense that and like accurate for a first rounder. But
Yeah,
a partner might, let's say we did that initial brainstorm, they just hit you with like,
for
what
sure.
else? What are you talking about? Like, I don't, tell me more about that category. I'm not really sure that we can flesh that out. They'll sort of sense like which one of the four areas that you identified in the brainstorming that like you sort of just didn't, you don't may not have as much meat or detail behind, and they'll press you on it
Hmm.
to see if you really believe what you're saying yourself.
Absolutely.
Um,
And this also shows the great variance between the interviewers you get, yet at the same time, they all are just as important in this job application process. So whether prompted or not to stop, whether prompted or not to give additional details, they're always looking for them.
And I think the last thing I would say is just like in general going through the case, like I felt most comfortable in this case with the non-analytical piece. I find some of these like really open-ended market sizings that were almost hypothetical, like because we're just making up a lot of numbers essentially.
Mm.
They're not entirely unreasonable, but like sometimes my brain gets a little bit too much in the headspace of are we really going to call this a $6 billion market
Mm.
definitively, when like we just literally made up all these numbers and went 20, 40, 60, 80, and then 80, 60, 40, 20, like,
Yeah.
and then also assume that all four of those markets were of the same size, 80, 80, 80, 80. Like, I guess I get almost frustrated with the simplicity of the assumption sometimes, but that is the
Yeah.
nature of consulting cases, and you have to be willing to do
Right.
that. So that'd be my final like self-analysis, but I think that wraps the feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. Good to
All
go.
right. Next case.